Hi guys, welcome back to week 2 of Psychology 3400, Social Psychology. So our topic for this week's lecture is aimed at discussing and understanding the fundamentals of social behavior. Take a moment and reflect on your own beliefs about what drives social behavior. Where does it come from? What's its function? In many ways, humans are presumed to be different from other animals. We see ourselves at the top of the food chain. We have all of this technology, this intelligence that we don't see reflected in other animals. And it's absolutely true that that does make us very unique. That said, we do share many of the same drives and behaviors that other animals exhibit, especially those that are closely related to us, like primates. So today we're going to discuss evolutionary perspectives on human behavior. We're going to talk about how evolutionary pressures have led to the development of culture in humans and ultimately how culture functions for each and every person, what it provides, and so on. So let's get into it. So, to understand human behavior and social behavior in particular, we need to take a step back and just briefly touch on where humanity came from. So, your book goes into this pretty well, but as we know, a long time ago, life happened. And single-celled organisms emerged and began replicating or reproducing. We now have the theory of evolution, which is that different species descended from common ancestors, that is, these single-celled organisms, that changed over time, acquiring different genetic characteristics as a function of different environmental demands. That environmental demands piece is a big deal, and we'll get into that here soon. But it's important to think about this change over time that happened, leading to the diverse range of beings we have on Earth now. This change over time occurred in two different ways. First, through mutation, which is random mistakes in DNA replication. So through reproduction, when DNA is being passed on, there can be a random mistake, a deletion, something extra in the DNA makeup that then might lead to different physical or behavioral characteristics that respond to the environment differently. Then that might get passed on, then leading to a different kind of organism. The other way that change occurs over time through reproduction is through sexual recombination. And so this is when two beings come together and make a new being, and it has a combination of genetics from the parents, making a unique genetic makeup rather than one that is identical to the thing that came before it. As we know from everyday life, this isn't necessarily always adaptive. So if you've taken a biology course, which you at least hopefully did in high school, if not in college, right, we know that sometimes reproduction leads to maladaptive problems. You can think of disorders like sickle cell anemia. That is from a DNA mutation and obviously leads to a major health issue that can cause death. What's important to note here is that these changes through reproduction cause variation that react to the environment differently. We're going to touch on this idea a few times in the next few slides. So then this brings us to the idea of natural selection. So in the last slide, we just talked about how life began as single-celled organisms, and through variations and genetic makeup occurring through reproduction, we have come to know the world as this place full of diverse and unique species. However, then it leads us to question why species became species, right? How did humans become humans? How did dogs become dogs? Why are dogs and wolves so similar to each other but technically different? So as you recall from the first lecture, a couple of the attributes that make a good theory include organizing information and explaining information. And that's what Charles Darwin did when he proposed the theory of natural selection to explain evolution. So basically, the theory of natural selection states that certain attributes are more successful than others in a given environment and will therefore become more prevalent in future generations. So I am not sure about everyone in class, but for me, the biology classes I took in college and in high school often used giraffes as an example of natural selection. And so you can see here by this picture that I included that taller giraffes have more access to the leafy green things that they eat. So they have a greater likelihood of surviving and then passing on their genes that will make their babies tall too, perpetuating height as a physical attribute in giraffes. Like physical attributes, behavioral attributes can also be selected for if they contribute to the fitness of the species. So that's something that we're going to be touching on a lot in this lecture as we understand how evolution has shaped certain behavioral tendencies in humans. The two key ingredients of natural selection are competition and variability. So out there in the world, there's rarely unlimited resources, and that means that you and everyone else in your species, as well as people outside of your species, are competing for the limited amount of resources, and any level of variability in your ability to get those resources is going to be paramount to life or death, and also paramount to your ability to reproduce and pass on your genes. Right, so because of this, variability and competition interact to determine which genes are passed on via reproduction in a particular environment. I really want to keep highlighting the particular environment piece here. It's important to note that what works in one environment won't necessarily work in another one. Adaptations are dependent on the environment they occur in and the extent to which they are successful in that environment. There's a constant process as things change, right? You can consider what it's like to be an animal in the wild and the number of factors that might change on a given basis that will then affect an animal's ability to successfully get the resources they need. So then this brings us to the naturalistic fallacy, which is a bias towards believing that biological adaptations are inherently good or desirable. I'm bringing this up because it's actually a pretty common argument in psychology and also just in our everyday lives to think that things that occur biologically or that have occurred because of natural selection are inherently good or desirable. In reality, nothing is inherently good or desirable. Those are subjective values judgments that are often based on our own personal opinions and upbringings. And so this is important for considering what survival of the fittest means. Fittest and survival of the fittest doesn't mean the strongest or the most amazing or the most powerful, but rather what is the best fit with the environment. And of course, the environment is always changing and depends on the time and place you're at. So what we can acknowledge here then is that fitness in one area does not necessarily translate to another area. There are breeds of dogs that are really good to have in cold places. They manage the cold really well. They're able to perform really well at those cold temperatures. If you were to take them to Miami, they probably wouldn't perform as well. And so this is an example of fitness in that they are the fittest in a colder environment, but this doesn't mean that they're the fittest overall. It depends on the environment. The naturalistic fallacy is really similar to the appeal to nature argument, which is an argument that things found in nature are inherently good. So the logic in this argument is basically something is natural, therefore it's morally acceptable. An example of this is that people will say eating meat is moral because plenty of animals are carnivores. One, this obviously doesn't make sense because plenty of animals are vegetarians. So the flip side is just as true. And as I already said, something about about morality is a subjective judgment, and so it's really not possible to say that something is inherently good just because it occurs naturally. Also, as we talked about, plenty of negative things occur naturally, including genetic mutations that lead to horribly painful diseases and death. Another example of the appeal to nature argument is that because animals are often aggressive with one another and will sort of wage wars over territories, that humans waging war is therefore moral. So now thinking about survival of the fittest, right, and the things that contribute to natural selection, I want to clarify between two different types of adaptations. So we have domain-specific adaptations. These are attributes that have evolved to meet a particular challenge, but otherwise aren't helpful in other domains. And then we have domain general adaptations. These are attributes useful for dealing with various challenges across different areas of life. So here in a moment, we are going to talk about some domain general adaptations that have really benefited humans in their development as a species. But what I want to note here is that the idea of domain-specific and domain general adaptations being separate is easy on paper, but there's oftentimes a lot of debate over whether something that is domain general actually has domain-specific components to it. So down here, I'm going to try and use the pen to circle this thing right here. That went terribly, you guys. Oh my goodness. I'm just going to leave it. Okay, so anyways, go into the PowerPoint, click on that link, please. It's a really interesting blog post on Psychology Today about domain generality versus specificity. And so in this article, they talk about critical thinking as this attribute that has been considered to be domain general, right? So someone who has critical thinking skills will presumably apply those skills in a variety of domains and benefit from it. That makes sense, right? But some researchers have started to conceptualize and investigate critical thinking as something that has domain-specific aspects to it. And that's because people tend to be better at critical thinking in some areas of their life versus other areas of their life. And one study that they did, that's described in this blog post on Psychology Today, they found that among people who had business experience or did not have business experience, those with business experience scored significantly higher on business-related critical thinking assessment than those who did not. So then this is consistent with this idea that working in business can improve your critical thinking skills just for that area, but not in a domain general type of way. I find this really interesting to think about because the idea of something as domain specific versus domain general really affects the way we think then that people can develop skills in those areas. And they actually touch on this in the article a bit about what it means to be teaching critical thinking skills to students. So if you see critical thinking as a domain general adaptation, you might sort of have this assumption that people are good at critical thinking or they're not. If you see it as a domain specific adaptation, then you might be more open to thinking that someone can at least develop critical thinking skills in one domain, if not another. This article I link actually doesn't talk about adaptations or evolutionary psychology. It's really more of a cognitive focus on critical thinking as a skill that might be domain specific or domain general. But if you read through this, and I really suggest you do because it's very interesting, you can take a step back and think about perhaps how evolutionary psychologists would start to investigate whether or not critical thinking is a domain-specific adaptation or a domain general adaptation. So now we're going to discuss 4 domain general adaptations that shape human behavior. We're going to spend a large part of the lecture discussing these and their implications for social behavior. Because of course these adaptations are still very relevant to us today and really provide a framework for thinking about human behavior. These are also outlined in the book, and I suggest you read these sections really carefully. I'm not going to cover everything that's in the book because that would be boring, but you should really know the material in the lecture and in the book for this section. And apparently I decided that this would be a really good break time before we jump in. So go ahead and take a break now if there's someone who prefers to learn in chunks. So the first domain general adaptation we're going to talk about is the social nature of being a human. So humans are incredibly, insanely reliant on one another for survival. Mammals like horses and cows can literally just birth their babies, and then the baby will just start walking immediately, and within, a couple hours is up on its feet, living its life. That is obviously not the case for human infants, nor the case for the infants of animals we're most closely related to, like primates. Our infants are born as incredibly vulnerable little raisins who can't do anything and won't be able to do much for months or even years. The survival of these little raisins is entirely dependent on their relationship with their caretakers. So it's important then that we be able to make quick bonds with people, especially those we're related to, to maintain survival and eventual reproduction. Even once little human infants become functioning humans, our social groups still provide protection from predators and increase the number of potential partners for reproduction. Access to all of the resources we need, such as food, shelter, water, safety, becomes much easier to manage when we're in social groups versus when we're alone. Because of this, socialization plays a huge part in our makeup as humans. Our socialization into our social groups to understand what conduct is and isn't acceptable isn't just a social norm, it's an important foundation to our survival as a species. We'll talk more about this later, but as humans evolved to exist in groups, each group developed its own ideas of what is and isn't okay. And in turn, it is absolutely necessary that the members of that group maintain those standards for what's acceptable so that way they could continue to receive the protection and the safety of being in a social group. This might be a little redundant, but I really want the takeaway from this slide to be that our social relationships with our caretakers and our social group at large provide us with safety, survival, and the opportunity for a diverse gene pool. And all of this contributes to fitness and the continuation of our species. So humans have developed several adaptations that help them maintain social connections. The first is these really strong abilities for facial recognition in other people. Humans are very good at recognizing other humans and interpreting their facial expressions. This is important so that way we can categorize people into friend or foe, safe or not safe. And it helps you do it quickly, right? So this would mean that you typically don't have to meet someone several times to remember their face and to know if they are trying to hurt you or help you. You can do it immediately. In humans, we have the fusiform face area. This is an area of the brain that functions specifically to recognize human faces. So people who have facial blindness, who are really bad at remembering or identifying faces, often have deficits and or malfunctions in this area. It's also important that we are able to interpret the feelings and thoughts that are expressed on people's faces. So not only do we have these great skills for seeing sort of static facial features and being able to place that with someone, but we also have skills for understanding what someone's face is trying to communicate to us non-verbally. This is incredibly important because it helps us avoid people who are angry and potentially trying to hurt us. It helps us understand if there is something threatening in the area, if someone in our social group is suddenly experiencing fear. It helps us read positive emotions like happiness or love to know that someone is pleased with us and we've made them happy, which means that we have maintained our social connections, which means that we're less likely to die. So an interesting thing is that there has been a little bit of debate in the scientific field as to whether or not the fusiform face area is related to interpreting emotions. For a long time, it was argued that this is really just an area that functions to process and remember faces and has nothing to do with the emotional interpretation of facial expressions. However, there's been some recent research in neuroscience finding that the ability to accurately recognize facial expressions is predicted by neural activity in the fusiform face area. So I want to bring this up because prior, people might have people might have categorized the fusiform face area as a domain-specific adaptation, right? So it would only function to recognize human faces, but wouldn't be able to do other things outside of that domain. This finding that the fusiform face area also has a role in emotional processing suggests that there is a little bit more of a generality to it. I'm not sure if it would necessarily be called a domain general adaptation because, again, it's still pretty much focused on facial expression. But again, this is how you can see how we're still doing research to understand how different areas of the brain, how different behaviors, thoughts, feelings, and emotions function. I also want to touch on that later we'll discuss universal emotion expression, at least for a second. But it's really just important to note how important it is for us to read emotions in other faces. And although this is functional, you can think about how it can be dysfunctional, right? So there's actually quite a bit of research on anxiety and trauma-related disorders and their sensitivity to angry faces. So people who have high anxiety symptoms or high trauma symptoms tend to notice angry faces faster and do have a stronger emotional reaction to them. Having a sensitivity to angry faces is honestly pretty functional if you think about how we want to avoid anger, but having a hypersensitivity to it might lead to mental health symptoms. And so this is one way how our adaptations can go a little haywire and lead to problems in our lives. Another thing that humans have developed as social beings is a really strong sensitivity to social rejection. If you'd like, you can take a moment to flash back to middle school when you were probably very sensitive to the judgment and potential exclusion of other people. And you may or may not have had an experience where you felt excluded, and there's a good chance that you tried to do something about that. Maybe you started dressing differently, you started making different jokes, maybe you joined a sports team just to seem cool. Who knows? But if that happened, this would really be consistent with the idea that humans are sensitive to social rejection and exclusion because it motivates them to maintain social connections. This has been researched quite a bit in social psychology under the umbrella of cyberball experiments. What's really cool about the cyberball experiments is that they were inspired by a real life occurrence that happened to Kip Williams. He's the guy who came up with the cyberball experiments and this research on social exclusion. So there's a video on YouTube if you want to look it up, but Kip Williams basically describes being at a park, hanging out with his dog, and how a frisbee came his way between these two other guys who were throwing a frisbee back and forth, and how he picked up the frisbee, he threw it to one of the guys, and surprisingly, the guy threw it back. And so for a few minutes, the three of them all threw the frisbee back and forth, and it was this great, amazing time. And then slowly, the two guys started throwing the frisbee back and forth and excluding Kip Williams. And he said that the pain and embarrassment he felt about being excluded by these guys he didn't know was just incredibly strong, and it really inspired him to turn this into a lab paradigm that could be tested. So then Kip Williams took this experience and turned it into this computerized game. And really, I suggest you look that up on YouTube. I didn't link it here because I didn't want to bore you guys. But the Cyberball experiment game is just so incredibly old school because it was the 2000s. And so there are these little dorky avatars that are throwing a ball back and forth. And in the game, it can be programmed that they eventually stop throwing the ball to the person who's playing, or they include them in the game. So in the first series of studies, they found that participants who were excluded in the online game of playing catch versus those who were not excluded in the online game of playing catch reported significantly lower self-esteem. There were also some other studies looking at the interaction of past experiences and the experimental manipulation. As you recall, in our last lecture, one of the fundamental assumptions of social psychology is that human behavior should be studied as a joint relationship between the person and the environment. This means that our research questions in social psychology often look at both experimental and correlational data. Hopefully this is all sounding familiar to you guys, and I'm bringing it up in hopes that it'll get integrated into your brain better. So this study here is a perfect example of that combination of experimental and correlational research, where they looked at people's past experiences with bullying. So that's something, right, that can't be manipulated. You either have been bullied or you haven't been. And then they randomly assigned them to be excluded or not excluded in the cyberball game. So those who had experienced bullying versus those who had not experienced bullying reported lower on feelings of meaningful existence after being excluded in the cyberball game. So we can see here then how people who have these past experiences of exclusion are going to react more negatively to current experiences of exclusion on really important measures like feelings of meaningful existence. That's a pretty significant feeling. So this research is very cool. Definitely take note of it. Very interesting. If you want to, look up some videos on YouTube. They're fun. So along these lines, social rejection is so important to our experiences as humans that neuroscience research has found that social rejection and physical pain activate many of the same brain regions. And of course, you've probably been in a situation where you felt rejected and you could feel that physical reaction, right? Your face getting hot, maybe some tightening in your stomach. It does feel physically painful to be rejected. So humans are sensitive to social rejection, but we are also sensitive to really feeling for other people. Humans are incredibly empathetic beings, and it's proposed that empathy might have evolved to maintain in-group relationships and facilitate that survival. One of the reasons why we think empathy might be an evolved feeling and behavior is because we've seen empathetic tendencies in primates and how empathy can motivate primates to do tasks that they otherwise might not wanted to have done. So there's been also some research on how empathy is related to our in-group relations. So there was this really interesting research done, and if anyone's interested in this article, I can send it to them. But they found in some experiments among students that people felt more empathetic when they thought that they were being asked for help by someone who was a member of their in-group versus someone who was a member of their out-group. They were also more likely to help someone who was a member of their in-group versus someone who was not a member of their in-group. They also found that empathy was related to perceived similarities in the in-group member. So everyone, right, was told that this person was an in-group or an out-group member, but then they also asked, how similar do you feel like you are to this person? And this seems to suggest that we're more empathetic to people who we see as being more similar versus dissimilar to us. What's interesting is that in this study, they were able to replicate this with a minimal group paradigm. So a minimal group paradigm is a paradigm where group membership is assigned arbitrarily or on something quite meaningless. So in this study, they came up with some kind of phony personality style and told participants that they either had the same personality style or a different personality style as the person who was being asked, as the person who was asking for help. And so again, this shows us that even when we have been given group membership with someone on an arbitrary level, we're still likely to feel empathy for them versus someone we don't share group membership with. Our next domain general adaptation that we're going to talk about is human intelligence. So, what even is intelligence? I kind of touched on this in the last lecture that intelligence is a pretty wide-ranging concept among humans that can be reflected or operationalized by test scores, personality factors, all different kinds of behavior. Because of that, it's hard to look at any given animal and say that they're not intelligent. As we discussed, all beings on Earth evolved to work in the environment that they're in. In that sense, it means that they're pretty smart because they've likely survived a long time and they've adapted to continue existence. That said, humans have evolved cognitive capacities to not only respond and learn from their environment, like most animals have, but to conceptualize their environment and themselves. And so what this means is that humans have the ability for imagination. We not only react and learn from our environment, we are able to understand the things in our environment as concepts. And we have the ability to consider things that haven't happened yet, to recall things from the past, and to consider any number of possibilities that the future might hold. What this means is that we have the capacity for symbolic thought. We are able to look around us and see things in the environment and describe those things in symbolic ways as meaning something that other animals wouldn't be able to understand. So the book uses an example of being able to look at a stoplight and understand that the color green means go and the color red means stop. But it's also an example of symbolic thought to even be able to look at those different shades and to be able to call one green and the other one red. So language is in one way. Language is really a great example of our capacity for symbolic thought. It's one of the most important outcomes of symbolic thought because it's allowed us to communicate in ways that most animals can't. Though some primates can do some rudimentary communication with one another, our ability to construct languages and to be able to talk with one another has given us a great advantage for being able to get resources in the world. Similarly to our understanding, really only humans have a strong understanding of themselves as a concept and awareness of themselves. So our current science suggests that really only humans can think of themselves as an I or a me. I can theoretically look at any one of you. Obviously, you're all at home listening to this, but if we were in a classroom, I could look at any one of you and say, who are you? And you can say your name, your age, that you're a student, and maybe you have a job. All of this reflects an ability to understand yourself as a concept, whereas most animals can really only react in the here and now and don't reflect on themselves like humans do. That aspect of only being in the here and now is also related to our understanding of time. So humans have the ability for temporal processing. We're able to understand that there was a past, that we are in the present, and that there's a future, whereas most animals are only in the present. This is why zebras don't get ulcers, which is a popular book about health psychology that explains why humans are so prone to stress and anxiety. And one reason why is because we are able to understand that the future holds a wide range of possibilities for us. And though hopefully positive things will come to us in the future, we unfortunately also have the capacity to understand all of the negative things that could happen to us at any point, including physical harm, disease, loss of people who are important to us, and our own eventual death. Humans' ability to stop, be self-reflective, and think about things is consistent with this idea that we have the capacity for both conscious and non-conscious aspects of thinking. We're going to talk about dual process theories more in the next chapter for social cognition, but I wanted to bring them up here because dual process theories of cognition argue that there are two general ways of processing information. We have automatic processes, which are thoughts or actions that occur quickly without the aid of conscious or intentional awareness. So an automatic process would be, oh gosh, I've forgotten the word for it, a startle response. So when you hear a noise and you immediately orient to the sound, that's an automatic process. That quick feeling of anger you get when someone cuts you off in traffic is also an automatic process, right? You probably didn't actually think anything, but as soon as you perceived someone cutting you off, you were immediately angry. Automatic processes are consistent with an experiential system of thinking. Experiential systems rely on emotions, intuitions, and images for decision making. So let's say you get cut off in traffic and you immediately slam on your brakes, right? That was a decision making process that you probably didn't consciously think of, right? Faster than you could think the words, oh, I need to slam on my brakes, you've already stopped. The other aspect of a dual process theory is controlled processes. So these are human thoughts or actions that occur more slowly and deliberatively, often motivated by conscious or intentional goals. So let's say you get cut off in traffic by someone who is acting like a real jerk and they're 100% breaking the law. So your automatic process is to slam on the brakes, right? But maybe after a moment, you think, this isn't right, this isn't okay, this person's dangerous. And so you have a thought to jot down their license plate number real quick so you can report them. That would be a more controlled process. It takes time and it's motivated by your conscious thinking. Controlled processes are typically consistent with a rational system. They rely on logic and analysis for their decision making. These two processes often work in tandem with one another. It's pretty common that you have an automatic response to something and then you end up sort of modulating your response as you have more time to process the situation. Nonetheless, we are under the assumption that especially conscious aspects of thinking that rely on a rational system are more uniquely human. Um, and our ability for controlled processes has allowed us to think through things, to build systems and organizations, to pursue science and create technologies that have given us really this amazing upper hand in navigating the world and collecting resources and in general just being really awesome humans. Our next domain general adaptation is to talk about the human propensity for goal seeking and obtaining. So humans are motivated beings. That's honestly not that special. All living beings are motivated towards life. But what's unique about humans is that they can rely on their intelligence, right? Their ability to conceptualize the world, to understand abstract concepts, to communicate in symbols, and use that to meet their needs and desires. When we talk about goals, what we mean are cognitions that represent outcomes we strive for in order to meet our needs and desires. So humans are able to move beyond just seeking our needs, right? To conceptualize what goals we have in mind to meet those needs. So you might have the goal of buying a house to meet the need of safety and shelter. Ultimately, we're motivated by hedonism, which is this motivation towards positive or good stimuli and the avoidance of negative or bad stimuli. Again, I would say we share this with most animals. Most beings are avoiding harm and pain and approaching towards things that make them feel good, like food and sex. Of course, there is a trade-off between immediate pleasure and long-term goals. So right now you're probably not getting a lot of pleasure out of pursuing your bachelor's degree, but there's an assumption that getting your bachelor's degree will improve your life a lot and bring you more positive or good things. This idea of a trade-off between immediate pleasure and long-term goals is really relevant to a lot of therapies like dialectical behavior therapy. I know this is a social psychology class, but as you guys know, my PhD is in clinical psychology, and I know that a lot of you tend to be interested in clinical and counseling. I think social psychology is so important to understanding mental health functioning, and so I just wanted to point out here that the idea of hedonism comes up in therapies like DBT, where people learn how to manage that trade-off between immediate pleasure and long-term goals. Sometimes people struggle with impulsivity towards immediate pleasures, and that ends up bringing them more pain. So if you're ever in DBT or training someone in DBT, you'll learn about this idea of enhancing positive experiences and how you need to have both immediate positive experiences as well as be working towards long-term goals that will bring you positive feelings. So your book proposes that there are really two fundamental psychological motives that are again consistent with this idea of hedonism. So we want security, we want to avoid negative or harmful things, and we want growth. So we want to approach positive things that make us feel good and make us feel like we are adapting and moving forward as humans. What does it mean though when these two things are conflicting? Things that often help us grow don't necessarily provide us security. Um, Sometimes growth hurts. You can think about things you've done in your life, hoping to grow as a person, right? Maybe you started a new workout plan. Maybe you joined the military. Even again, pursuing a bachelor's degree, all of those things tend to be a little scary, and maybe make you feel a little insecure about your ability to meet your goals, about your ability to provide yourself with financial security when you're doing things like investing in a college degree. Yet those things help you grow, right? They help you develop skills, they hopefully bring meaning to your life, and the hope is that at the end, you will be better off for it. Our fundamental motives towards security and growth can be understood by looking to childhood. Your book talks about the work of Otto Rank and his observations of children, and I suggest you read that closely. But here I wanted to loop in attachment theory, which is something we'll talk more about in the semester when we cover interpersonal relationships. According to attachment theory, early childhood relationships are integral to lifelong development and functioning. This is a pretty basic idea. So, according to attachment theory, our interactions with our caretakers in early childhood help us develop an attachment style, which is one's general way of relating to others. So, you might have heard terms like secure attachment, anxious ambivalent. These all refer to ways that people relate to other people. However, research in social psychology shows that attachment style in general is related to a wide array of outcomes, including personality, mental health functioning. The way we relate to others really explains how we relate to the world and how we relate to ourselves. This is important to note here because our attachment figures are supposed to provide security through support and safety during stressful times, and they are also supposed to facilitate growth by acting as secure bases that allow children to explore. So you can see here how our attachment figures set the foundation for our motives for security and growth. And just like our attachment style affects our lifelong trajectories, right, it makes sense then that our attachment styles also might be associated with how we are motivated towards security and growth in general. So I really just wanted to pull in this developmental perspective that we are motivated towards security and growth from a young age. And we learn things about our motivations towards security and growth through our attachments. Our strivings for security and growth are applied to really any kind of situation. We want our relationships to be secure, but also fun and exciting. We want cars that aren't going to kill us, but can drive fast. We want careers that are engaging, but we don't have to worry about losing them. In most things in our life, we're looking for things that provide us with stability and excitement. And this is likely related to the fact that our attachment figures are supposed to provide us with both security and growth in our childhood. Okay, so here's another break time for anyone who wants to take a break before we move on to the next section. Okay, welcome back to anyone who took a break. Let's take a moment, and if you would, take out a slip of paper, or maybe write it down on your phone, and write down what some of your goals are. What do you want out of life? What kind of person do you want to be? What does success and happiness look like to you? Before our break, we were just discussing the motivations towards security and growth that we all have. And it's presumed that these are lifelong motivations that are intertwined and are sometimes in conflict with one another. Our motivations towards growth and security can often be understood through a hierarchy of goals. Look back at that list you wrote. You probably wrote that you want to have a successful career, a happy family. Maybe you said that you want to be a good person or a good student. On the other hand, maybe you wrote that you want to travel or that you want to sleep more, which I find incredibly relatable for anyone who wrote that. As you can see on the slide, the hierarchy of goals outlined here assumes that we all have very abstract goals that we are striving towards, namely being your ideal self. I think this is an assumed goal on their part, but it's probably pretty relevant to all of you. And I can say that personally, I think I'm also striving for my ideal self. But the thing is that when you have a goal like this, right, to become your ideal self, to be a good and successful person, really that goal is achieved through increasingly more concrete goals. Right, so here we can see that in this example I have, part of what being the ideal self is being healthy. But what does it mean to be healthy? Well, being healthy means being in good shape, avoiding stress, eating a healthy diet. And how do you do those things? So you can be in good shape by exercising, going to yoga. You can see how these things get more and more concrete. The idea here then is that you reach goals, right, that are pretty abstract in their explanation by doing concrete things. You will achieve your goal of being in good physical shape by exercising once a week. And you'll achieve your goal of being healthy by eating a healthy diet, which consists of eating salads 4 times a week. What's interesting is research has found that achieving goals is done most successfully when there is a balance of superordinate and subordinate goals. So you can see over on the right the classifications there. So if you're just working with superordinate goals, like be your ideal self, but you don't actually have goals for how to achieve that, you're unlikely to ever feel like you've achieved your ideal self. Likewise, if you have these concrete ideas of what you should be doing, like exercising, doing your homework, getting enough sleep, but you don't really have a reason why you're doing them, right? What it means to you to be doing them, you're less likely to achieve them. And so successful goal achieving, which of course achieves our dual motives of security and growth, is done by a balance between abstract and concrete goals. What happens when one's goals can't be achieved? Presumably, hopefully, one would set new goals, right? They would find a different way to be their ideal self and come up with new subordinate and superordinate goals from there. However, sometimes people get stuck or they perseverate. And so there's this really interesting theory introduced in the 1980s called self-regulatory perseveration theory of depression. And it basically states that depression can occur when a person becomes fixated on a goal that they cannot achieve. And this creates a distance between actual and desired self states. So this theory builds on the idea of the hierarchy of goals and also loops in this idea of self-awareness. We're not going to go too deeply into the function of self-awareness, but this theory assumes that self-awareness always enacts the state of standard striving. So that what that means is that people reflect on themselves and consider what goal is closest to them and whether or not they're living up to that goal. So for example, if I want to be a healthy person and I reflect on myself, I might realize that I'm not really working out that much. I've been really busy. And so I don't know if I'm really reaching my goal of being a healthy person. That self-focus on whether or not I'm reaching my goals can create a state that is not comfortable, right? If I realize I'm not working out, even though I want to be healthy, I might start to feel bad about myself. Typically, this would motivate me then to work out and to achieve my goal and to be happy. But let's say something happens to where I can't ever work out. And so I'm constantly focusing on how I can't work out because I'm too busy, but I want to be a healthy person. This creates a persistent state of self-focus that leads to persistent negative affect and low self-esteem, which then in itself can turn into depression. So one research study in this area found that when participants were asked to focus on themselves versus externally, those who were depressed reported more negative events compared to non-depressed participants. And so what this suggests is that those who feel bad about themselves and are focusing on themselves are more likely to bring up ways that they're failing, creating sort of this cycle of negative self-talk that will further contribute to depression. And so I wanted to tell you guys about this theory because it's really interesting, in my opinion. And again, it shows you another way that these social psychology concepts help us understand mental health problems. So your takeaway from this slide is that when people are not living up to their goals, this can create negative feelings that should motivate them to meet their goals. However, if they can't meet their goals and they continue to focus on their failed goal, that can lead to depression. Our fourth domain general adaptation we're going to talk about with humans is that humans are emotional. Emotions are often seen as bad. Being emotional is often confounded with being irrational, and people sometimes feel bad about the emotions they have. But just like everything else about you and every other human, emotions evolved for very helpful functions. First, there's the personal function. So this states that emotions motivate actions when goals need to be reached and needs satisfied. So this is really consistent with everything we were just talking about in the motivation section, right? So we were just talking about with self-regulatory perseveration theory that people will feel negative emotions when they realize that their goals haven't been met. Similarly, we feel negative emotions when we're being socially rejected because a goal that most of us have is to be included in social situations. There's also a social function to emotions, and that's that the internal experience of emotions is often accompanied by external displays that signal and communicate with others. So not only do our emotions motivate us to do things, but they help us communicate with others, our needs, our desires, whether we like them or dislike them, whether there's danger in the area. And so our emotions really have these dual functions, and it's important that you understand both of them. So we have three different kind of levels of emotions as they're discussed in your book. We have background emotions. These are general affective states. Another way to think about this is that background emotions are kind of like vibes. Like that person gives off a negative vibe or an angry vibe or a chill vibe. I know I probably sound like I'm trying to be really cool and I'm so sorry about that. But I think it's actually a good description of what background emotions are. These are affective states that haven't necessarily been triggered by anything. They're just kind of existing in the background in general. Then there are primary emotions. So these are a set of emotions that are consistent across the world regardless of culture. These emotions are typically known to be happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. And so we know that these are consistent across cultures. because they tend to be evoked by the same types of things. And oftentimes there is a consistent facial expression there. So earlier I was talking about universal emotional expressions. Primary emotions tend to be associated with universal emotional expressions. Secondary emotions are variations of the primary six emotions. So these are more fine-grained. They might be a little bit more culturally influenced. They're also influenced by language. So if you've ever seen an emotion wheel, it will typically have happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust. And then it'll show the secondary emotions. So under happiness, you might find joy, cheer, contentment, right? All these things that all basically mean happy, but have slightly different meanings to people. If you become a therapist or if you do therapy, you'll find that there are a lot of discussions around secondary emotions and helping people identify their secondary emotions. So a good example is disgust. Disgust is one emotion that has a really strong basis in evolutionary science. Evolutionary psychologists often study disgust. If any of you guys have taken a class with Leif Alshawaf, he is our evolutionary psychologist who's done some really interesting research on disgust. So if you're interested in doing research on that, maybe bother him. So one of the ways that people have identified disgust as a emotion that has evolved is the fact that it seems to occur across culture consistently in these three domains of pathogen disgust, sexual disgust, and moral disgust. So even though the stimuli that evokes disgust might change across cultures to an extent, what we find is that disgust responses can easily be packaged into these three sections. What's fun, and I should have included a picture, is that disgust often evokes a very specific and notable facial expression. I think you guys all know what I'm talking about, right? Like the curling of the mouth and like the scrunching of the face. Disgust is easily identifiable. So our first area of disgust is pathogen disgust. This is disgust in response to objects or stimuli that may have harmful pathogens, such as rotting food. So if you've ever, like sniffed a carton of milk and it smelled bad, that was pathogen disgust. And it evolved to protect you from ingesting something that might poison you and kill you. Sexual disgust is in response to sexual activity with an unfit partner. So when I say unfit, I don't mean like they're not physically fit. What I mean is that they are unlikely to have a successful sexual experience with you that leads to good reproduction and the passing on of genes. So you feel sexual disgust, or hopefully you feel it, in response to a close family member, because that would not be a good genetic makeup to mix your genes with family members' genes. A lot of problems could come from that. Similarly, you probably feel sexual disgust in response to someone outside the age of reproduction. So a child or an elderly person might induce sexual disgust because you're unlikely to be able to reproduce with them. You right now might be thinking that you would have sexual disgust at the thought of sex with a child because that's wrong, right? Well, that's not sexual disgust, that's moral disgust. So disgust is in response to behaviors that do not meet the standards of the in-group. So moral disgust evolved to maintain those in-group relationships. Moral disgust is obviously the most variable in content. So things that are morally disgusting can be anything from eating food with one's hands, to using your left hand for things, to having sex outside of marriage, to murder, right? So there's a lot of variability in moral disgust, and that one is, of course, the one that changes the most between groups. Definitely know these three different areas of disgust and their functions. I think disgust is really interesting, and so we will probably cover it more in the future. Oh, I wanted to mention here there's this concept of cultural universals. Cultural universals basically refers to this idea that there are universal behaviors or concepts across cultures, even though they might look different in content. So moral disgust might be a cultural universal, and that everyone has things that evoke moral disgust within their culture, but what evokes moral disgust in their culture depends from culture to culture. Another set of emotions we're going to discuss are social emotions. These are emotions that are typically focused on other people, and they tend to regulate social behavior. You might wonder how an emotion such as shame is considered a social emotion, because for most of us, shame is a pretty personal, secret thing that we experience and don't tell others about. But shame is considered a social emotion because it almost always involves the standards or expectations of other people in your life. Shame tends to be you feeling like a bad person because you feel like you haven't met the standards of being a good person in a given situation. Social emotions help us regulate our behavior. So, one way is that social emotions can draw attention to socially inappropriate behavior. When you're feeling kind of contemptuous than someone, or like you're better than them, or feeling proud of your own behavior in reaction to someone else, you are distancing yourself from that behavior that's not good for the in group. Social emotions also regulate behavior by reinforcing appropriate social behavior and helping to repair disrupted social relationships. So when you feel guilt because you kind of haven't been texting your friend back in a while and you finally do something about it, that guilt is to motivate you to fix the relationship so that way you can maintain that connection. The motivating effects of shame and pride and other social emotions have been studied in several areas of human behavior, including voting. So, this one interesting study looked at how mailers affect voting behaviors in two Midwestern towns. Have you guys ever received one of those mailers? I received one a couple years ago, and it was like mad at me for not voting in 2014, and I 100% felt shame about it. I was like, I didn't vote in 2014. I'm a horrible American citizen. So there's actually a lot of research that's been done in understanding how to motivate people to get out and vote. And this one study was really interesting because they randomly assigned people to receive mailers. And in one mailer, it said that the names of all verified voters would be published in a local newspaper. So this was supposed to prime pride in potential voters. The other condition said that the names of all verified non-voters would be published in a local newspaper, and this was supposed to prime shame. And so what the study found is that pride motivated voter turnout among high propensity voters, but not low propensity voters. So people who were likely to vote were motivated more by pride compared to people who are not so likely to vote. However, shame motivated voter turnout regardless of voting propensity. So this suggests that those who aren't as likely to vote might benefit from being publicly shamed, which is interesting. This is just one way that social emotions can motivate behavior. And if it's something you're interested in, I definitely recommend looking into it more. We'll probably touch more on shame and pride and other social emotions throughout the semester. But social emotions have a big role in not only social behavior, but in mental health functioning and cognitive and developmental psychology. It's really interesting. So next we're going to talk about cognitive appraisal theory. This is a theory of emotion that proposes that our subjective experience of emotions is determined by a two-step process. First, there is a primary appraisal, basically determining whether or not the instigating stimuli is benefit or harm. This often occurs before we are fully conscious of what's going on. Is this sounding familiar to you guys? We talked about it earlier in the lecture. This would be a automatic process, right? When we were talking about dual process theories of cognition, we talked about automatic processes, and within cognitive appraisal theory, we see that a primary appraisal sounds a lot like an automatic process. Going back to our example of a car cutting you off, right, that primary appraisal would be harm. And that appraisal would probably happen before you're even fully conscious of what's going on. Within cognitive appraisal theory, we have secondary appraisals. This is a more differentiated reaction, one that is more consistent with controlled processes. So here, people are able to take a step back, potentially modulate their emotional reaction once they understand more of what's going on. This kind of thing is pretty closely related to emotional differentiation, which is the ability to recognize more fine-grained distinctions of emotions, such as shame versus guilt, resentment versus frustration, loneliness versus sadness. So if you get cut off by a car, your primary appraisal is going to be harm, and then your secondary appraisal might be anger, but also a sense of justice, like you've been done wrong. And it's through emotional differentiation that you're able to understand really what your reaction is there. Because it's not just that you were potentially being done harm, but someone was breaking the rules. And that really only comes when you're able to reflect on it. It's important to note here that language plays an important role in emotional differentiation. So your ability for language helps you clarify what you're experiencing. This is related to the idea that there is a reciprocal relationship between cognitions and emotions. There are sometimes arguments regarding whether cognitions affect emotions or emotions affect cognitions, and really there's evidence to support both directions. It's likely a bidirectional reciprocal process. So what we see is that increases in anxiety increase perceived sensitivity to threat. So that's an example of emotions affecting cognition. But we also find that when certain emotion words are made salient, so that's a cognition, people are more likely to experience that emotion. Okay, and now we have another break. I think there's one more after this. So I've been trying to give you guys more breaks. I've heard some people are doing kind of classes in 20-minute chunks, and so I'm trying to do that a bit more. So feel free to move on through or to take a break for a bit. So far in this lecture, we have talked about how humans came to be and the propensity for social behavior that all humans have. This propensity for social behavior has led to the development of culture, which in turn has helped humans advance socially. So every human has three primary psychological dimensions. There's the universal, so these are the evolved characteristics shared by all humans that we just talked about. There are individual personality, values, attitudes, and beliefs. And then there's the cultural. The cultural dimension of each human refers to the aspects of each human that have been shaped by the particular culture that they have been socialized by or currently inhabit. Take a moment to consider your own culture. The way that your culture has affected your upbringing and who you are as a person is hard to really remove from your personal characteristics. So much about our culture involves teaching us how to be a human. Certainly, there are individual things about you, and we'll talk about that as we continue through the lecture. But it's through our families and our culture at large that we learn our language, we learn the rules for navigating the world. Our culture is really paramount to our existence. I think it's hard to imagine what it would be like to not have some kind of cultural upbringing. And the only thing I can think of is that you would basically be like a feral child. So, a culture, for academic purposes, is a set of beliefs, attitudes, values, norms, morals, customs, etc., all shared by a self-identified group. I want to touch on cultural evolution, which is the process whereby cultures develop and propagate according to systems of beliefs or behavior that contribute to the success of a society. The thing about culture is that, like everything else in our environment, cultures are constantly changing. Cultures are rarely static. Those rules, norms, attitudes, beliefs that we just talked about as being part of the definition of culture are rarely static. One way that cultures change is through cultural diffusion, which is the transfer of invention, knowledge, and ideas from one culture to another. This is made possible by the human capacity for language, so that way we can communicate our cultures to one another, and our motives towards growth, right? Our desire to know more, to learn more, to change as people, leads us to intermingling as cultures. How does diffusion happen, though? It can happen in a lot of different ways. One way that it happens now is through media representation. Thanks to the access to media that we have in this internet world, um, and Netflix, I suppose, you have the opportunity to expose yourself to cultures from all over the world or subcultures of the United States that you might not be very familiar with. Historically, cultural diffusion has happened in a lot of different ways, and sometimes not so great ways, like, for example, through colonization. So, the book, for example, uses the Roman Empire and its effect on culture. It did so much domination across Europe that Roman culture ended up being integrated into a lot of other people's culture. You can also think about why the English language is kind of considered our world language, and that's because of colonization done by a lot of English speaking countries going to other countries and forcing their language upon them. We also have the concept of cultural transmission. So these are explicit or implicit processes where members of culture learn to imitate the beliefs and behaviors of others in their culture. So I was talking about social cognitive theory in the last lecture about how we look to others to know how to behave. Right, so cultural transmission is an example of social cognitive theory. Children often learn important norms, morals, and customs from their parents, teachers, and peers. It reinforces our cultural ideas and behaviors. It might be helpful to think of other explicit or implicit processes that facilitate cultural transmission. One example I thought of was I actually knew a girl who went to finishing school. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with that concept, but it's kind of like this education where you learn to act like a proper lady. And so like you learn how to set a table and how to curtsy and things like that. So that would be another example of cultural transmission where someone is explicitly learning the rules of a culture, right? In this case, a subculture, to maintain the things that are held important in that culture. So she was from a very like classy Catholic background, and um, because of that, her family really valued being proper, and that's why she went to a finishing school. All cultures provide us with rules, norms, attitudes, and behaviors, things for navigating and understanding the world around us. That said, there are some distinctions amongst cultures. For example, there is the idea of a collectivistic versus an individualistic culture. Like I said, these serve the same function, but they emphasize different values and behaviors. So, in a collectivist culture, there's an emphasis on interdependence, cooperation, and the welfare of the group over the individual. Um, Typically, collectivist cultures tend to be Eastern, so it's common in Japan, Korea, India. Examples of how collectivism works in this culture is how a lot of decisions are made on behalf of the family. So places that potentially still do arranged marriages, that is in part to make sure that there is a good meshing of the families. Same with people from collectivist cultures often make jokes about having to become, a doctor and engineer to make their parents happy. Um, and so that's an example. And within collectivistic cultures, people tend to have interdependent self control. So they view themselves primarily in terms of how one relates to others and contributes to the greater whole. This is contrasted with individualistic cultures, which emphasize individual achievement and creativity over the maintenance of social cohesion. So, the United States is often considered an individualistic culture. You are encouraged to do what you want, to do what makes you feel happy, to pursue individual success and fame, even. People in individualistic cultures tend to have independent self control, so they view themselves as individuals um, who are pursuing their own self serving goals. So, sort of like with the marriage example, it's fairly rare here that people would be including their families in their marriage decision making. And children here are really encouraged to find whatever career makes them happy. Of course, that varies from family to family, but overall, there's a relative difference in comparison to collectivistic cultures. So earlier we talked about social emotions and the role that social emotions play in reinforcing pro-social behavior and diminishing antisocial behavior. Our cultures set forth the rules for what is pro-social and for what is moral. So moral foundations theory builds on this idea to talk about the morals that are at play in our cultures and in our groups. Within moral foundations theory, moral intuitions are defined as gut feelings about what is right and what's wrong, and they basically define how we should behave. Feelings of things being immoral help facilitate group living, right? We can cooperate with people better when we all agree on what's moral and what's immoral, and this ultimately helps us compete with other groups. But individuals who have moral intuitions accepted by the group are more likely to survive and to mate. So, according to moral foundations theory, there are 5 universal moral foundations um, relevant to every culture and every person. The first is care slash harm. So, this refers to protecting others in your in group, of course, and not harming people in your in group, right? So, this would be being good to your fellow man and protecting your neighbor. The second is fairness slash cheating. So this is about justice according to shared rules. Um, that part is important, right? So how often cultures or societies are just is questionable. There have been times in America's history where we look back and we see things as not being very just. So the fact that women couldn't vote until the last century, and that's also the case for men of color, is objectively unjust. But at the time, before those things happened, people probably argued about whether or not it was moral, because at the time, the shared rules were that's fair. So it's important to note here that it's not about objective justice, but justice of the shared rules of the culture. The third foundation is loyalty slash betrayal. So loyalty refers to standing with your group, your family, your culture, and not betraying them. The fourth is authority slash respect. This refers to submitting to tradition and legitimate authority. Actually, should note here that shouldn't be authority slash respect. That should be authority slash subversion. So subversion is obviously the opposite of authority. The fifth is sanctity slash degradation. So this is where disgust plays in. Remember talking about disgust earlier. And so this is associated with moral reactions to things that are disgusting. And of course, that depends on the culture that you're in. So, considering your own moral background, what you think is moral and immoral, you should realize that these things are impacted by several things. First, ancient evolved moral intuitions, but also socialization into the culture of your parents and socialization into the culture at large. Socialization into the culture at large includes pop culture, so the things that are represented as moral and immoral in our music, movies, and TV shows. Additionally, your own reflection and creative integration of all of those things informs your morals. Especially as you get older, you find yourself reflecting more and more on what you truly believe is right or good or bad, more so than just what you've been told growing up. If you guys want, you can take the test. It's the Moral Foundations test, so it'll tell you which foundations are more or less important to you. You can take it for fun. There's not going to be any test or anything on it. It's fine, but it might be interesting for you. So some pretty common findings within the Moral Foundations research is how political identity relates to the strength of one's moral foundations. So this is consistent in American research on this. It's also been found in the UK that the more conservative people identify, the more all of the moral foundations are pretty important to them. That said, among people who are neutral or even liberal, you start to see how harm and fairness tend to be much more important than the other 3 moral foundations. So that means for people who are sort of moderates or strongly liberal, right, in that range, they tend to value that sense of justice and that sense of harm reduction um, as, as being morally relevant compared to in-group loyalty, respect for authority, or issues around disgust. I am honestly pretty interested to see if this would still pan out as we deal with our current political world. As you guys all know, it's kind of crazy out there. I wonder if, identifying as strongly liberal to strongly conservative is really the best measurement of political identity anymore. And if there would be a better way to look at political identity and how it relates to morals. So, something to think about. So here I had another break planned. I feel like I went through that last set of slides pretty quick. We have another 12 slides remaining. I'm not sure how long they'll take, but probably another half hour or so. So you can take a break now, or you can continue on through, but this will be the last set before the end of the lecture. So we are on the last section of our lecture for today, and I saved the best for last. So we have talked a bit about what culture provides for us. It gives us rules and direction for how we're supposed to act. It gives us a great sense of security and provides us with pathways for meeting our needs, as well as directions for growth. In addition to all of that, culture helps us understand our metaphysical environment. What I mean by this is culture helps us answer the big questions about life that all humans are plagued with. So being a human means having the capacity to wonder things like, what's the purpose of life? And does objective meaning exist? And what happens after death? Unlike any other animal, we are uniquely aware that we will one day inevitably die and no longer exist. And that feasibly this could happen at any moment, including right this second. These are scary and hard things to come to terms with. And culture provides us with an understanding of how to manage these questions. Not only does our culture keep us physically safe from death, but cultural values help us deal with the concept of personal death. And that's what we're going to spend the next few slides talking about. This brings us to terror management theory. Some of you might be familiar with Tom Pazinski. He is a distinguished professor in our psychology department. He's been here for a while, and he's a really nice guy who looks like Santa Claus and slash or maybe Jerry Garcia, whichever you prefer. So in the 80s, when Tom was young, he and his friends from grad school, Jeff Greenberg and Sheldon Solomon, introduced the idea of terror management theory to the world of social psychology. Terror management theory was inspired by the writings of anthropologist Ernest Becker. In Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, he covers, from a really interdisciplinary perspective, people's thoughts and reactions to the idea of personal death. And Becker goes on to suggest that people deny their personal death because the idea that one is going to die one day is pretty sad and disturbing. And Becker suggests that people deny it by investing in their cultural worldviews. Terror management builds on this idea to explain what the function of cultural worldviews really are and to test these ideas. So, terror management theory basically suggests that humans manage the idea of their inevitable eventual death by investing in cultural worldviews that make the world seem like a meaningful, manageable place in which they can feel like a good person. So, as we've talked about, our cultures provide us with rules for being moral, for being good, and they reinforce these rules through social exclusion or inclusion, right? And the experience of social emotions. So, our worldviews provide us with a way to feel good about ourselves. And terror management suggests that ultimately our worldviews allow us to feel like we are going to transcend death in some way. Obviously, we know that we can't really transcend death, but there are beliefs that allow us to feel like death isn't such a big deal. These ideas correspond to the concepts of literal and symbolic immortality. Literal immortality is this idea that there's some form of life after death, typically for those who are worthy. So, a good example here actually is the recent passing of Chadwick Boseman, the actor who was in Black Panther. Um, this was a really shocking and sad death for people because I don't think anyone knew that he had cancer, and he has been such a cultural phenomenon since Black Panther came out a few years ago. What's interesting is that after his death hit the news, people started sharing this section from Black Panther that I will hopefully quote correctly. Sorry if I don't. But in the movie, there's a scene where Chadwick Boseman's character says something like, in my culture, death isn't the end. And there's something really comforting about that. And people shared that in the wake of his death, presumably hoping to get a sense like maybe Chadwick Boseman isn't really gone. This is one example of literal immortality. Another one comes from the idea of an afterlife in most religions. I'll talk about Christianity because that's the one I'm most familiar with. So within Christianity, there's this idea of a heaven, and there's a general idea that if you're a good Christian, you'll go to heaven. What it means to be a good Christian, though, depends on your culture, right? So there is a Bible, and there's fundamental Christianity, which, to my understanding, interprets the Bible literally. But other sects of Christianity don't necessarily interpret everything in the Bible literally. And so within each culture, there is an idea of what it means to be a good Christian and what it means to be worthy of an afterlife. There's also the idea of symbolic immortality. This is the idea that by being part of something greater and more enduring than our individual selves, some part of us will live on after we die. So if you've ever felt like you wanted to contribute to something bigger than yourself, because it'll be there when you're gone, this is an idea of symbolic immortality. This might be why people derive so much meaning from being an American or being a service member, right? Because you feel like you are contributing to something beyond yourself, something that is meaningful to a lot of people and something that will last a long time. So, similarly, our cultures that provide symbolic immortality set rules forth for how to be a good member of that culture. So, for example, if you were a service member who, was dishonorably discharged, you might not feel like you're really living up to that culture's rules, and you might not feel like it really provides you with a sense of symbolic immortality. So, regardless of it being literal or symbolic immortality, our cultures provide us with these rules, right? These pathways for feeling like we're living up to their standards and that in some way our death will be less impactful because of our contributions to those cultures. Interestingly enough, we can also talk about Chadwick Boseman's symbolic immortality. So, Chadwick Boseman has clearly affected a lot of people in his portrayal as Black Panther. That has been really important to a lot of people in the Black community. Also, just him being an actor means that he has contributed to something more enduring than himself because his movies will last forever even though he's gone. So that is another sense of symbolic immortality. You know, at least on this plane of existence, he doesn't exist anymore. But he has made this contribution that will persist long after we've all died. So, as I mentioned, our cultural worldviews provide pathways to obtaining symbolic or literal immortality. They outline clear rules and standards for what it means to be worthy, and ultimately they provide us with a sense of self-esteem. They also provide a sense of meaning and importance to life. So even though we know, right, that most of our worldviews are arbitrary, um, it gives us a sense of purpose to have a rule set that we're supposed to follow. Like I just said, cultural worldviews are arbitrary. We ultimately don't know what's right or wrong, especially when it comes to things like whether you should hold the door open for the opposite sex, whether you should bow to someone who has more authority than you, right? Those things are quite arbitrary, but very meaningful in some cultures. Because we have so many worldviews out there and because they're all, not that meaningful objectively, cultural worldviews facilitate and require social validation. So confidence in our worldviews are bolstered through social consensus and social validation. This is where social comparison theory comes in. You guys hopefully remember talking about that in the last lecture. So again, we compare ourselves to let us know we are living up to the standards of our worldview. So we look to others to make sure that we are doing what we're supposed to do to be worthy members of our culture. What this also means is that we don't like people who don't provide us with the social validation of our culture. So terror management theory has suggested that we don't like people who aren't in our in-group because they ultimately threaten the validity of our cultural worldviews, which in turn help us strive for immortality. So I wanted to briefly revisit the hierarchy of goals that we talked about earlier in light of terror management theory. So earlier we talked about our striving towards security and growth and what this means for goal achievement. And we also talked about how our goals tend to be pretty abstract with increasingly concrete ways to achieve those goals. In light of terror management theory, we can think about why we are motivated to achieve our goals. So it's not just because we're motivated towards security and growth, but reaching our goals helps us feel like we're living up to our worldview, and that in turn helps us feel like our lives are meaningful and like there might be some sense of immortality for us. So here I have modified this hierarchy of goals to ultimately aim to transcend death. Really, I'm sharing this slide with you guys because I think it's interesting to think about. You're not going to be tested on this slide here. Um, I just wanted you guys to sort of think about how all of these pieces come together and how terror management theory would explain these other ideas in social psychology. right? So here this suggests that terror management theory would look at the hierarchy of goals and say that the hierarchy of goals is important because it ultimately helps you transcend death. When it comes to something like self-regulatory perseveration theory, which we talked about earlier in this lecture, where people experience depression when they're not able to achieve their goals, yet can't disengage from those goals that they can't achieve. One reason why people maybe get so upset is because those goals are helping them manage this really scary thing, which is the idea of their own death. So I just thought this was interesting to think about. And if you have any thoughts on this, you can come to office hours or email me and we can talk about it more. So we have talked about the general idea of terror management theory, and now we're going to talk about some of the scientific findings. Um, this theory is a big deal because it proposes to explain a wide range of behavior ultimately aimed at gaining self-esteem and making meaning. And so I want you guys to be really familiar with it. And it's really likely I'll reference it throughout the semester because I have studied terror management theory for a long time, for, gosh, 7 years now. So first, we're going to talk about some of terror management's core hypotheses. The first one is the mortality salience hypothesis. So mortality salience just means death awareness, but because they're scientists, they have to say something fancy. And the mortality salience hypothesis states that if cultural worldviews function to alleviate anxiety associated with death awareness, then reminding people of their mortality should increase their need for the protection provided by such beliefs. So what this means is that reminders of death should make you more defensive of your worldview and should motivate you to live up to the values of your worldview more. The classic study here is the 1989 Rosenblatt study. So in this study, they recruited municipal judges who were exposed to mortality salience or a control topic, and then presented with a hypothetical legal case regarding a defendant charged with prostitution. Judges were asked to recommend a bond level for this hypothetical defendant, and those who were primed with death versus those who were not recommended a significantly higher bond amount for the hypothetical defendant. So I say significantly higher, that doesn't sound that exciting, but in the original study, the mean for those who were provided with death was $450, and the mean amount for those who were not reminded of death was $50. So that's an insanely large difference that happened there. And the idea here is that judges were threatened by the idea of death, and they manage those reminders of death by reasserting their morals, right? By judging prostitution, which of course was not legal there, and I don't think it's still legal there because this study collected in Arizona. The second hypothesis in terror management theory is the death thought accessibility hypothesis. So this hypothesis suggests that threats to terror management resources increase how accessible thoughts of death are. So when one's personal cultural values are threatened, they report higher levels of death thought accessibility. There is also research finding that if you ask someone to think about a breakup with a romantic partner, that increases their death thought accessibility too. Death thought accessibility has historically been measured through this word stem task, where people are presented with these incomplete words and they're asked to fill them in with the first word that comes to mind. So looking here, you see these three words, and you can fill them in with the first word that comes to mind. I think almost everyone puts coffee at this point. I think even when you've been primed with death, coffee is just super salient to people, but you might put in coffin instead. The second one could be grand or grave, and the third could be skill or skull. And the idea here is that if you fill in more death-related versus non-death-related words, that suggests that death is sort of highly active on your consciousness. This word stem task is an implicit measure. So an implicit measure is something that aims to measure something without the participant's consciousness. Typically, we just ask people how they're feeling. That's called an explicit measure. So if I asked you, how much are you thinking about death right now? That would be an explicit measure of death thought acceptability. But that's kind of a weird question to ask. One, you might not answer it truthfully. And two, you might be suppressing it because death is a weird thing to talk about, right? So this relates to what we talked about in lecture 1, where we talked about how sometimes people don't have the best awareness of why they do things. And similarly, people might not have the best awareness of what's on their mind. Because of that, we look to implicit measures that look to covertly measure what's going on for someone. So the word stem task is often presented as just a cognitive task that you should do as quickly as possible. So it's looking to measure death-related thoughts without you realizing it. Some of you who have been in the program or at UCCF for longer than this semester might have participated in one of these studies where you had to do this. I will say now that if you end up participating in a terror management study here, because they're often happening, please tell the researcher. I think we talked about this in the first lecture about the concept of demand characteristics. So demand characteristics occur when participants know what the point of the research study is, or they think they know. So people who understand terror management theory are going to react differently to terror management studies versus those who aren't aware of terror management theory. So if you find yourself participating in a terror management study where you're asked about death, let them know so that way they can throw out your data. You'll still get the SONA credit or whatever. But it's important for research purposes that people know. Our third terror management hypothesis is the anxiety buffer hypothesis. So this basically states that bolstering terror management resources, such as one's worldview or self-esteem, will protect against reminders of death. So in one study, participants were exposed to violent videos and then their anxiety levels were measured. Participants who received a self-esteem boost prior to watching the violent videos actually reported lower levels of anxiety compared to those who did not receive positive feedback. And so this shows that when people feel especially good about themselves, or they feel good about the extent that they live up to their worldview's rules, death has less of a threatening effect on them. So the anxiety buffer hypothesis that we just talked about is really consistent with this general idea in terror management theory that our worldview and our self-esteem help us deal with the idea of death, right? Our culture and feeling like we are a contributing member of our culture makes death seem less serious. However, some people struggle with the idea of death more than others. So in 2011, anxiety buffer disruption theory was introduced, and it basically stated that traumatic events can undermine the effectiveness of typical terror management resources, and that this in turn contributes to psychological distress and existential anxiety. So our worldviews provide us with a sense of meaningfulness and a way to feel like a good person in the world. But traumatic events often challenge our sense of meaningfulness in the world. And so this theory explores the idea that for people who are experiencing traumatic stress symptoms, that they might not derive as much meaning from their worldview as people who are low in traumatic stress symptoms. And so this has been supported by several research findings, but I'll just touch on this one. So in this one study, they sampled domestic violence survivors and assigned them into low or high trauma groups. So they did this by measuring their trauma symptoms, and those who reported low levels were in the low trauma group. Those who reported high levels were in the high trauma group. And what they found was that low trauma participants responded to mortality salience by judging moral transgressions more harshly. This is to be expected, right? In several studies in terror management theory, they found that reminders of death increase the judgment of moral transgressions because it's a way of reasserting your worldview when you judge other people, right? We talked about that with social emotions. What they found is that high trauma participants did not judge moral transgressions more or less harshly after reminders of death. It seemed like reminders of death had no effect for traumatized people at all. So this suggests that people who are high in trauma don't rely on their worldview to manage the idea of death like people who are low in trauma do. It's then suggested that when you're not managing the idea of death through making meaning out of your life, you're more likely to experience psychological distress and fear about one's existence and mortality. So I wanted to tell you guys about this theory just as like a clinical application of terror management theory that I think is really quite interesting. Terror management theory has also been applied to terrorist attacks, including the September 11th terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. So this book was published in 2003 in the wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, and it basically proposed that the September 11th terrorist attack acted as an intense and traumatic mortality reminder to American identity. I'm guessing a lot of you are too young to remember it, and I was in first grade. I don't remember it either. But people who were adults at the time of 9/11 report just a sense of disbelief that such a thing could happen on American soil. I think the 9/11 attack was really a threat to vulnerability and to our sense of safety as Americans. And that's also what this book suggests. Some research found that subliminal presentations of words and phrases associated with 9/11 actually led to higher levels of death thought accessibility, supporting the idea that the terrorist attack was a death reminder. Within the framework of terror management theory, things like increased nationalism, hostility towards foreigners and Muslims, and desires for vengeance were all proposed to be ways that people dealt with the mortality reminder of 9/11. So all of these are ways of sort of bolstering one's worldview as an American in response to that attack on American identity that happened. So I really want you guys to be familiar with terror management theory and yeah, how it can be applied in all kinds of different situations. Another thing I wanted to touch on is cross-cultural research in terror management theory. Some criticisms of terror management have suggested that terror management defenses are really only applicable in Western cultures or in the United States. However, there's been some research finding that terror management effects also occur in interdependent cultures. So there was one study where Japanese students were sampled, and they reported the extent to which they were encultured with Japanese culture. So what this means is how much they identify with Japanese culture. Then they were asked to rate their views on personal success. So those who identified more highly with Japanese culture responded to reminders of death with more negative views of personal success. This is really consistent with the idea in Japanese culture and in most interdependent cultures that your successes shouldn't be celebrated, right? You're supposed to be part of the group. You're not supposed to be a successful individual. Those who identified less strongly with Japanese culture responded to reminders of death with more positive views of personal success. So that suggests that those who identified less strongly with Japanese culture maybe are less interdependent in their self-control, and that they have more independent self-control. And because of that, they responded to reminders of death with more positive views of personal success. So we are nearing the end of the lecture, but I also wanted to touch upon the idea of tolerance within terror management theory. So terror management provides us with an understanding for why intergroup conflict happens. According to terror management theory, our worldviews provide us with a sense of meaning and pathways for immortality. However, our worldviews require consensual social validation. And so those who don't share our worldview, therefore threaten our worldview and our sense of meaning in life. This makes sense, but we live in a multicultural world oversaturated with media images of other cultures. Especially here in the US, plenty of cultures appear to mingle in harmony. Why is that? It may be that tolerance acts as a cultural value for some people, and this helps us maintain intergroup relations, even though other groups might threaten our ideas of our other values. So support for this idea has been supported through a few research studies. In one study, it was found that politically liberal participants who were assumed to value tolerance more than conservatives actually decreased their dislike or increased their liking of a dissimilar other when asked to evaluate a conservative after reminders of death. In that same study, politically conservative participants increased their dislike of a politically liberal person after reminders of death. So that suggests that people who value tolerance will actually respond to reminders of death with more tolerance towards an outgroup member rather than less. Another study found that when tolerance was primed for participants, and then those participants were reminded of death, there was actually no difference on responses to criticism of the United States. For participants who weren't primed with tolerance, mortality salience led them to have more negative reactions to US criticisms. So what this means is that mortality salience might lead people to be more critical of outgroup members, but if tolerance is primed, then they won't be as critical. So it's important to see here how tolerance and other values about respecting other cultures can potentially reduce intergroup conflict. Okay, we have finished up for this week. I hope you guys had a fun time with the lecture. We covered a lot of really interesting and important material. So some reminders for you guys. The quiz is being pushed back 1 week due to persistent book problems. The bookstore is being problematic and annoying, and some people are still struggling to get the things they need. So because of that, the quiz for the second chapter, quiz 1, will be due September 13th. All the other quizzes are still on the same due date, so you will have 2 quizzes due September 13th. They're pretty short, they're not too hard, but you do need the book for them. My other reminder is that it's September, and our first exam is September 24th. It's multiple choice and open book, and based on weeks 1 through 4 lecture and reading. So just start thinking about that. It is open book, but it will be timed, so you kind of need to have your life together prior to going to the exam. And of course, there are some things that are only covered in the lecture that are not in the book, and so you need to be familiar with those. And on the flip side, there are some things that are covered in the readings that I don't talk about in lecture. So be familiar with it. I'll do a brief review prior to the exam. If anyone needs any accommodations prior to then, please let me know. Thank you. Have a good week, guys.